governance indexes slide. I can see the chat, so you're more than welcome to drop things in the chat.
Okay, I see it. You're good to
Sweet.
go, and we are recording. Thanks, Rachel.
Perfect. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Olson. I am the Outreach and Engagement Librarian here at UNCG, formerly the Social Sciences Librarian. I still work with lots of social science areas, including political science, which is kind of where governance indexes tend to come into play. And I will talk about what this is, what it means, give you some examples. We'll go over all that good stuff. If you have questions at any point, feel free to raise your hand, drop questions in the chat. Like I said, I have multiple screens, so I can see you and I can see the chat. First of all, governance indexes or indices, which one is it? Well, I looked it up. They're both technically correct. An index is really what you would call something like an alphabetical list in the back of the book, in the back of a book that tells you where to find things. And indices is usually the plural for the kind of thing that we're talking about. So I probably should have called this governance indices, but we're not going to worry too much about it. So a couple disclaimers. I am an expert in the location and evaluation of information. I'm a librarian. I am also someone who finds governance indexes and indicators interesting. You'll hear me use the terms index, indicator, indices, like kind of interchangeably. I am not a data librarian or data scientist. I am also not a political scientist or a politician. I am also not someone who creates governance indexes. So keep that in mind. I'm more than happy to answer questions here. But you may hear me say things, and if you are a data scientist watching this someday in the future, you might be like, I disagree with that. Absolutely feel free to chime in if that's true. I just sort of have had fun exploring these and kind of learning more about the format. So just quick questions. How would you describe your role at UNCG, if you want to put this in the chat? And then how would you rate your level of experience with governance indices on a scale of 1 to 5? 1 being I'm completely new to these, and 5 being I am a total expert. I'm just interested in who is in the room. So I will wait a second. Okay. I'm getting a 1. And I'll also say while people are typing, if there's something that you know about these as we're going through that I'm not mentioning, absolutely feel free to chime in. Okay, 3-ish and a 1. Okay, cool. So we're mostly new to these, but maybe a little bit of experience for some of us. So that's cool. Good to know. This is a quick agenda, which I will mostly stick to. So I wanted to actually start with a very quick discussion of gray literature because governance indices are a type of gray literature. So gray literature, if this is new to anybody, we're basically talking about sources that don't fit within normal academic publishing models. So when we're talking about scholarly articles, or when we are talking about books, things like that, those categories are, they're not black and white, but they are a little bit more straightforward. Whereas gray literature is kind of a term that we use as a catch-all for other stuff. So dissertations, theses, most government information, newsletters, reports, white papers, it depends on who you ask. We do have a really good tutorial on gray literature that I just wanted to be sure to point out to y'all. Anybody can use this. It does go into a little bit more depth about types of literature. I find it to be really useful. There are also some questions where you can kind of check your understanding. I'm having issues today with videos showing up in this little type the characters below box, but you should not see that when you go in. There will actually be an embedded video there. I've been having issues with that on multiple platforms, so ignore that. Anyway, if you are interested in gray literature, even beyond governance indices, feel free to explore that tutorial more. And I can make arrangements for you to have the slides here if you would like them. There are pros and cons to using gray literature, right? So some pros that I can personally think of, and feel free to put any in the chat that you can come up with. Gray literature doesn't go through a peer review process in a traditional way, and peer review can take a long time. So gray literature can be more up to date than the peer reviewed stuff. It's also a lot of the time, not all the time, it's freely available. The gray literature can tend to be at least mostly freely available. That's not true 100% of the time, but I'm just sort of speaking generally here. So those are some pros. Some cons, I mean, I think that there are people out there who really, really love the peer review model and the peer review process. It is considered the gold standard in academia, for better or worse. I have lots of thoughts and feelings about it and its pitfalls. We could do a whole session on that, but that's not why we're here. So there are definitely pros and cons to using gray literature. Governance indexes, as I said, are a type of gray literature. So let's go on to the next slide. Famous indices that you may have heard of. These are not governance indexes. These are just kind of more general ones that you may have heard of in sort of everyday life. The Consumer Price Index is a pretty famous one. It is published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it's used to make decisions about things like taxes, public assistance programs. It has to do with inflation, cost of living, and they use these indicators here. I'm not going to read them all off, but you can see them. This is sort of what helps them come up with the particular numbers and things that they are using, different factors. And they have people who work for the Bureau of Labor Statistics who help to compile all of this and verify things, prices. Stock market indices, you've probably heard of the Dow Jones, the NASDAQ, the S&P 500. Those are all indexes. And there are lots of bond market indices as well. There's a question in the chat. If you're doing a research paper and you're using a qualitative research model, does that fall under gray literature? So that's a really good question. Qualitative really refers to a type of research and not a type of publication. So it kind of depends. Like you could have a book that's talking about qualitative research. You could have articles that talk about qualitative research results. You could have gray literature that talks about it. So it kind of depends on the source type rather than the type of research. But if there's a specific source that you would like to know about, definitely feel free to check in about it later. We can take a look. It's a great question. So yeah, lots of different famous indices. Governance indices are a little more specific. So it's measuring how a government is ranking or doing compared to other governments. And it can be very general, or it can be specific to a particular part of governance. So we're going to look at some here in a little bit. One that I like talks about overall freedom of a country, like a freedom score. And then you also have the same organization publishes internet freedom score. So they get a little bit more specific. There are many, many, many dozens of them out there. We're only going to talk about 3 or 4 just for the sake of time. There are lots of different considerations that go into producing these. There are lots of questions that have to be asked. I think some of the particular challenges with these are, how do we evaluate governance? Like, how do I decide how one country's government is doing compared to the government of another country, particularly when we're talking about countries that are completely across the world from each other, and may not have a ton of interaction, or it may be characterized one way or another. It's difficult to simplify that, to boil that down and put a label or a number on it. How do we boil those things down without leaving out important things? That's another important consideration. I don't envy the people who have to answer these questions or who have to consider these things. It is interesting to think about, though. So common uses for government indices, and I'm showing you, I mentioned those freedom on the net scores. We're going to look at that a little bit more in depth here in a minute. We're comparing between countries on a variety of factors. Again, some are general, some are specific. I'm going to open a new tab. This comes from an organization called Freedom House. And they actually have this freedom map, which I'm hoping you can see. You can look around. This is the general, what they call the freedom in the world score. So you can look over a country. Purple would be not free by their standards. The brownish is partly free, and the green is free. So if we look at Australia, for instance, Australia scores a 94 out of 100 on this freedom in the world scale, and we'll look at where that comes from. And they are considered free, whereas if you look at Kazakhstan, 23 out of 100 not free, versus Mauritania, 38 out of 100 partly free. So it's kind of all over the place. For just ease of use, we could look at United States if you want to, and 81 out of 100, and that is based on scores specifically to do with political rights and civil liberties. So if we click into this, you can also see how it's changed over time. A lot of these indices and reports and organizations that do these are indicating a shift toward authoritarianism in the United States that is backed up by data. It's backed up, it's not just, a general comment that people are making. They do have some evidence for it, and we'll look at that. I'm going to click on United States, just the title. It will give you an overview of the country. It'll give you population, things like that. You can see the global freedom score, which is the more general one, and then the internet freedom score. So I could get more specific into those things, and we may. I will kind of zoom in here so you can see key developments in 2025 that kind of affect the score. And then we're not going to scroll through all of this, but I just want you to see they start with, there's a section on political rights. So for each country, they're looking at the subsection. So electoral process, they're answering this particular question with each one, and they give you the scale. So it's a scale of 0 to 4 here. They also have sections on participation politically, sections on functioning of government, things like that. So you can see they're pretty transparent about how they scored things, and then they add all of those up, and that is essentially how you end up with that. I do want to look at the freedom on the net scores, which can be a little bit more difficult to see more on the United States. I'm trying to, the internet freedom score right here, 73 out of 100. It's interesting, and you could look at the freedom on the net tab, and it'll kind of break that down for you a little bit more, things that specifically factor into that: obstacles to access, limits on content, violations of user rights. Again, they have a similar scale. What I like about organizations like Freedom House is that they're very open about their methodology. So we could actually look directly at their methods. They tell you what they measure, how they do it, the scales that they're using, checklists of questions. So I really appreciate that level of transparency in a governance index. And that is something that I would encourage people to look for. Make sure that you can find their code book. Make sure that you can tell how they arrived at the conclusions they arrived at. I think that's probably the most important thing that I'll say about governance indices, is that the more transparent they're being about their process, probably the better. It's also interesting, the Freedom House scores are largely based on the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A lot of you have probably heard of this, but I will just kind of quickly open this up. This is not new. This has been around for decades, and you can read through the different articles here in the declaration. It's about 8 pages long, and they do base some of their like definitions of like freedom and human rights, things like that, are based on that document. So it's interesting stuff. Now, you've heard me use these terms: indices, indicators, things like that. I kind of want to explain the way that I think about it. And again, I'm not a data scientist. There may be people who feel differently about this, but for me, it helps me to understand indicators as being made up of data points. So with the question of, so there are these World Bank Worldwide Governance Indicators. There are 6 of them. One of them is political stability. So when I'm thinking about, okay, how do we measure political stability? What data points might we use to decide whether or not a country is politically stable? Does anyone have thoughts on that? You can feel free to put them in the chat or unmute. Like, how might we go about answering that question or evaluating the political stability of a country? I'll give people a second, and I can tell you how they did it.
I have some input. So you were
Yeah,
saying, I'm sorry, you were
yeah.
saying the court was just trying to measure something like political stability within the country. Is that correct?
Yeah, like what kind of data might you want if we're going to try to answer that question? Like, how do we determine whether or not a country is politically stable?
Um, Besides, kind of like data? I mean, looking at the government, like could we answer it by like looking at like the government and who's in charge and stuff? Like for example, with Sudan, a coup had happened recently where like there is a rebel group that's in charge of the government.
Mm-hmm.
Can we do a evaluation of the way that the women are treated in the country? So understanding women's
Yep.
rights and stuff, and how they're being treated, can evaluate like how a country and stuff stands. You know, whether the religious sects and stuff are fighting, whether there's like a certain like control over like a predominant like sect in like an area, could also be a good indicator of like how political stability of the country. Like for example, when
Mm-hmm.
it came certain areas in like Indonesia, there is a certain sect of Islam that's very strong, that kind of like, you know, oppresses the other sects of Islam and other religions sometimes, you know. So just looking
Mm-hmm.
at that conflicts is just one way to understand how, you know, the political stability of the country is as well too, and like their access to basic like human rights like water and stuff like that could also help you look into that as well too, like, you know, after war,
Yeah,
that kind
those
of.
are all great potential data points that you could take a look at. I mean, I was also thinking about things like, so voter turnout rates is something that somebody said in the chat, also a great one. All the ones that you listed just now are fantastic. I was thinking about how many times has the government of the country been overthrown? How long has that particular government or model of government been in place? You know, if it's a brand new country, we've only been around for the last 10 years or so, that may or may not have something to say about political stability or risk. It could be interesting. With the World Bank, again, they're really transparent. This is actually their code book for how they have determined the political stability of a particular country. And we can look at some of these indicators. So a lot of the times you're going to sorry, I lost my train of thought. What I really like here is that at the end of this, they're giving you the code. So they're saying, okay, if you see CCR, that means that we got that particular data point from Freedom House, which is one we were just looking at. There's some interesting stuff here. So they're getting data from the European Union. They're getting data from the Heritage Foundation, if that rings bells for anybody, the World Bank. They're getting data from Varieties of Democracy Institute, also known as VDEM, which we will look at, the World Justice Project. They're doing lots of different organizations with lots of different political leanings. Some of you may have recognized some of those. So it's interesting. They are looking at data from kind of all over the place, all over the political spectrum. And they're telling you that for this one particular indicator out of 6, which is political stability, here's how we did it. Here's what we looked at. So we took from VDEM, they took a number on clean elections and electoral violence. They're letting you know which data point they have used to sort of, as they aggregate all of these things together into scores. So it's super interesting to look at. If you are into data, coding, anything like that, this may be of interest to you. You can also see a little bit more broadly their methodology with the worldwide governance indicators. This just kind of talks a little bit more about it. They do have these interactive data pages that I would encourage people to use. I struggle with a little bit with this, particularly in Chrome, so it might be worth trying in a different browser, but you can play around with this. I mean, you can compare things between particular countries, particular indicators, if that's something you're interested in doing. Potential issues with their methodology. I mean, I think that they have people who work really hard at this, people who know what they're doing, data scientists who are experts in this sort of collection and evaluation of information. But I do think there are potential issues. I think that some of the organizations that were listed here, or maybe I already closed that, some of the organizations that were listed under the code book for political stability, I might question some of these organizations and whether or not they're the most reliable sources of data. Depending on who's looking at it, they might have questions about different organizations. So it's kind of, I don't want to say that they're all subjective, but I do think the answers aren't always going to be clear cut about these indices and how they're formed, and what they might be pointing to in terms of conclusions we can draw. So there's a couple of examples that I wanted to look at. Freedom House we talked about. VDEM is a big one. I really like VDEM. You can just look at raw data if that's something that you are interested in. I want to see the VDEM data set. You can download certain sets. If you are using R, which is a software for data, you can absolutely do that. I personally, and they're very, very specific about how they do this, how they aggregate the data. I really appreciate that. For me, yeah, absolutely. You'll have links to these later. For me, I actually prefer, when I'm doing a quick overview like this, to just look at the reports. So VDIM's latest democracy report actually just came out in March, and we'll talk about where it showed up a couple places later on. And they do give you some data here. So if you're like me and staring at raw data sets is not necessarily your thing, not necessarily something that you feel super comfortable doing, or interpreting data is not your thing, or you're just limited on time, looking at the reports can be really, really interesting. So this is kind of what they're looking at. So some of their biggest observations, again, this is VDIM, Varieties of Democracy, they are noticing a shift toward autocracy worldwide, in countries that were kind of previously thought to be moving toward democratization. They are now seeing a shift toward autocratization, and that's not just in one or two countries, that is happening worldwide. So you can see in the last 20 years, they're kind of giving you some general overviews. You can see share of the world's population that lives in what is considered an autocracy. So in 2005, by their standards, 9% of the people in the world lived in an autocracy, whereas in 2025, 41% of the world population lives in an autocracy. You can see that lots of different data points here that I really appreciate. Again, it does not require me to stare at a particular table and try to draw those conclusions myself, although I could, because I would have access to the methodology and I could ask myself those questions. I find things like VDIM and Freedom House to be really useful for students. Who, I work with an African political systems class, at Freedom House and VDIM, we've definitely used before. What I like is that they've done the analysis themselves, they give you the results, and then you can kind of draw some conclusions from that. It's a very long, detailed report. I encourage you, if you're interested in politics, to take a look at this. It is illuminating, to say the least. Lots of different types of figures as well. So if you're not super comfortable looking at a pie chart versus a line graph versus a bar graph, they've got lots of different visualizations here that you can look at, and rankings. They are also, it's interesting to see what indicators they've chosen to use. Like here, media bias is one, free and fair elections, freedom from torture, different factors that you might not necessarily think about. And it's kind of all gathered in one place, which I like. So this is a VDIM. This is their latest report. There are the worldwide governance indicators, which we've talked about. There's also one called the Fragile States Index. This one is not the prettiest. I'll see if I can get the country dashboard to cooperate. Yeah, so this is it for the United States. And you can see here the ranking. So out of 179 countries, the United States ranks 141st in terms of being a fragile state. I think originally this was called the Failing States Index, and then they've kind of backed off that language over the last couple decades, or they made that shift at some point to call it the Fragile States Index. So out of 179 countries, with the first being the most fragile, the most vulnerable, and the 179th being considered the most stable, the United States is 141st. And you can see how we've changed from the last year, how we've changed over the last 5 years, 10 years. You can look at their overall score. So I definitely appreciate seeing this and seeing it kind of laid out. And these are the different indicators that you could potentially click on. So right here, this one has to do with the security apparatus of the country. You can see this one has to do with state legitimacy, economic equality. I think there are 11 indicators that they use for all the countries, and this is how they are kind of making those determinations. You can see economic indicators, which are also really important. Economic data plays a big, big role in governance indices and the creation of these tools. It's based on all kinds of different things. You could teach an entire course on governance indexes. I think that would be super interesting. And you still probably would only scratch the surface. So I'm not going to do it justice in a 30-minute webinar, but if you are interested, I'd be more than happy to talk with you more about this. I will share these links with you. A couple other things. I chose the United States as a obvious example. to look at across a couple to see how it compares. So we looked at that global freedom score, internet freedom score. So this one's from Freedom House. This one is the Fragile States Index, which we just looked at. This is VDIM. They do in particular in their 2026 report, again, just came out, they call out the United States as a really conspicuous example of autocratization. You can make of that what you will, but in one of their particular charts, they do call out the United States. This is a larger view of that same chart. So there are 62 countries that they evaluated that out of all the countries they evaluated, 62 of them were identified to either be pushing toward democratization or toward autocratization. And you can see that this is what their data shows. A couple important considerations as I'm sort of beginning to wrap up this part of the section. Not all governance indexes are created equal. You got to be careful. There are some out there that are just kind of not super transparent, not super reliable. So don't necessarily take every score that you hear, excuse me, or every ranking as you hear as like the truth. You need to kind of evaluate some of those things as a user of information. It's not just about individual scores and data points. Like I said, the reports are a really rich resource. Now, if you are someone and you have the time, you have the know-how in terms of data and digesting data to look at the raw numbers yourself, I encourage you to do that because they're often available. And you could flip through those tables, use programs like R to kind of do your own analysis, and that could be really interesting. Organizational funding is something we didn't talk about. Who paid for this research to be done? Who pays the data scientists who work for these organizations? Who paid for the information to be published and disseminated? That is really important to consider when you have something like this. Also, these reports don't go unnoticed. This is an NPR story from March 20th, so just a couple days ago. Basically, what they're saying is that the VDEM report that I just showed you drew certain conclusions and called out certain things about the United States. And they asked the White House, NPR asked the White House to comment on it, and they did. So this is about that conversation between the White House and NPR about this VDEM report that we were just looking at. So they get noticed, they get talked about. It is where a lot of news organizations are going to, some of the headlines are being pulled directly from these reports, basically. So they're not unimportant. It's important to understand them and kind of know about them. So tell me what questions you have, or if there are comments, things that people who might also be familiar with these sorts of things might have to contribute. Please feel free, unmute, throw in the chat. I'm happy to show other things. Yeah, Micaiah, I don't want to pronounce it wrong.
It's fine. It's Micaiah. Thank you so
Micaiah.
much.
Sure.
I just want to thank you so much for this informative lecture that you gave.
Sure.
I think it was incredible and it helped me a lot when it came to like researching for like my own research and stuff. I just do have a question that I want to ask you. So when it comes to like governments and like the different political systems and stuff that they're under, and the way that we view like human rights violations or the political, scheme of the country and stuff. Because this is just kind of my concern if I were to explain to someone else. How do you explain like these charts and this data and stuff without it coming off as, a perceptional type of thing, if that makes sense? I hope I'm asking this right because, when we talk about human rights violations and all these issues and stuff like that, people will still try to say, well, that's your perception. Other countries like that have it worse. And America can be that bad, but you have the data to show like there are some significant issues. So how would you navigate that, and what advice would you give someone?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, a lot of people will look at things like the NPR piece here and kind of the headlines that they're pulling and the big like sexy sounding sort of one-liners that they're pulling and say, "Oh, well, that's your opinion." And I think that following that up with, "Okay, well, that's my opinion. Maybe, but here are some data points. Here are some specific things that were specifically called out. Like with human rights violations, you could look at torture, reports of torture in a country, like the number of times that was reported, percentages. I think that VDEM had some of those available. Or you could also look at with elections, you could look at voter participation turnout, you could look at you could look at data about policing, about police violence instances. Sorry, I'm getting a little tongue-tied. I think that when you're having those conversations with people, I personally, when I'm talking to someone about things like this, appreciate data. I appreciate like, okay, here's what you're telling me. And I think that people sharing their feelings is great. I would like to see it backed up by some facts, backed up by some figures. So I think just kind of being ready to point to those things, being ready to say, here's how I know. Here's what I am using to draw those conclusions. Just being ready to explain. And it's really hard to have conversations with people who might not align with you politically. But I think for me, at the risk of sounding preachy, I try to stay open to what other folks believe. I try to back up what I'm saying with data, and I hope that they can do the same. And if they can't, then you know, encouraging them to do some research of their own, encouraging them to say, hey, I hear you. This is maybe what I would encourage you to look up, because there are, we live in a world where so many things are. People will say, oh, well, that's your opinion. Well, I have data. I have evidence. So I think that's an important thing. So, but the delivery of that's tough. That's one for the communicators and the politicians, I think. Other
Gotcha. And
questions?
yes, I do have another question. I'm so sorry.
Sure.
Is it appropriate if I ask this question in regards to my research, just because I'm looking for advice and stuff and guidance? Is it okay if I? It's gonna be a
Sure.
short question, so if
That's
I
fine.
relate to
I
that.
will say, sorry to interrupt, but that we could turn the recording off too. If you don't want talking about your research.
I have a
Yeah, I
question
don't
that may
want.
be germane more
Yeah.
broadly.
Yeah, and like maybe we should wait to make sure all the broader questions are answered first. Yeah.
We could come
Okay,
back to your question, McKay,
Yeah.
if you want, after we
Sure.
stop the recording, if you want.
that's fine. Thank you so much. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. That's okay.
No, you're good.
Yeah, Christy, go for
So,
it.
Rachel, I have a question about access. A
Yes.
lot of these data points are things that our community partners or community partner researchers would really appreciate having their hands on. And I want to make sure I didn't miss any single sign-on logins or anything. All of that we talked about today is public.
That's correct. Yep, everything that
Excellent.
we've talked about today is public. There are some that I have seen before that do sort of live behind paywalls, but nothing that I talked about today, to the best of my knowledge, is paywalled. And if people, just for sake of the recording, if there's anybody who runs into a paywall or something like that, I would encourage you to reach out to your librarian, whether that's UNCG, a public library, something like that, just to check and see if they have a way around or some sort of access. But yeah, everything today, VDIM, Freedom House, those world governance indicators, those are run by the World Bank. Everything that I have seen or talked about today is free.
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, great question. Any other sort of general questions? Okay, well, we could stop the recording, and anybody who wants to hang out is more than welcome. And then, McKay, if you have a specific question to your research, I'm more than happy to try and answer. I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna stop the recording. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.